Story 1. Elias Vance knew two things about train stations. They smelled of stale coffee and diesel, and they were never truly silent. Even in the dead of night, there was always the hum of electricity, the far-off clang of shunting cars, or the muffled announcement from a distant platform. Blackwood Junction was the chilling exception. It was 1:17 a.m. The air was a heavy, wet blanket of fog and coal dust that had been settling for 80 years. Elias sat huddled on a splintered wooden bench marked Platform 2, northbound, which hadn't seen a northbound train in at least 3 decades. His own train, the Midnight Express from Ashford, had suffered a critical engine failure 20 miles back, and he, along with 12 other miserable souls, had been bussed to this abandoned relic of the British rail era to await a relief engine that may or may not exist. The station house was a Victorian monstrosity of soot-stained brick, its leaded windows opaque with grime and condensation. The glass roof over the main platform was shattered in a dozen places, allowing the icy, misting rain to patter rhythmically onto the greasy concrete below. The ticket booth was dark, its small window barred by a rusty grille that looked more protective of the outside than the inside. Elias wasn't just a stranded passenger, he was an enthusiast of the forgotten and the macabre. He had chosen this route specifically because he'd heard the whispers about Blackwood Junction, the stories of the Phantom Express, the signalman who vanished, and the terrible silence. Terrible silence, he muttered, pulling his wool scarf tighter. The quiet here wasn't restful, it was a hungry, palpable absence of sound. It felt like the space between heartbeats, only extended indefinitely. He checked his phone. No signal. The digital clock read 1:18 a.m. That's when the light came. It wasn't the harsh, sodium yellow floodlight of modern rail. It was a pale, incandescent yellow, sickly and flickering, emanating from the depths of the abandoned signal box. The signal box stood 100 yards down the track, a skeletal 3-story tower that loomed out of the fog. It was supposed to be boarded up, condemned since the Great Fire of '57. Yet, a single window on the top floor now glowed with the weak, anxious light of an oil lamp. Elias stood up, his heart thumping a quick, uneven rhythm against his ribs. The other stranded travelers, a sleeping elderly couple, a man arguing softly into a dead phone, a group of restless students, hadn't noticed. The fog swallowed the light almost instantly, but Elias had seen it clearly. He walked toward the edge of the platform, the crunch of his boots on the loose gravel the only sound in the universe. Below him, the twin iron rails, slick with moisture and rust, stretched away into the infinite white mist. He stopped just short of the drop-off. The air grew perceptibly colder here, the kind of cold that seemed to originate not from the environment, but from within his own bones. "Platform change, please," a voice whispered, thin and reedy as dried paper, right by his ear. Elias spun around, stumbling slightly. There was no one behind him. The other passengers were too far away. He knew that voice. It was the phantom call of a long-dead public address system, echoing an announcement that should have been swallowed by time and decay. It wasn't loud, but it had the unnerving clarity of something meant only for him. He looked back toward the tracks. The rails themselves seemed darker now, almost black, and the gravel between them seemed freshly disturbed. Then, he heard the whistle. It was distant, agonizingly mournful, and high-pitched. The sound of a steam engine's whistle from a bygone era, one that used low-pressure boilers and mournful, brass instruments. It was the sound of something large, heavy, and fast approaching. Elias glanced at the rusted, unlit track indicator. It was set for the main line, and the main line was not Platform 2. The wind suddenly picked up. Not a natural wind, but a pressurized rush, like a heavy object forcing its way through the air. The smell of cold iron, hot oil, and something horribly coppery, like old blood, hit him. Choo-chunk, choo-chunk, choo-chunk. The sound of a train approaching was impossibly loud now, but still, no headlight pierced the fog. Elias pressed his hands over his ears, his breath catching in his throat. He looked down the empty track, his mind screaming for the logic of a modern train. A flash, a roar, a warning. But this was not a modern train. This was the sound of a ghost train, riding the very rails of his mind. A shadow, darker than the night, longer than the platform, swept over him. The air thrummed with a heavy, vibrational energy that made his teeth ache. He felt the immense, passing bulk of something colossal just a foot from the platform edge. He shut his eyes and heard, for one terrible, defining moment, the sound of hundreds of dead passengers coughing in the close confines of their carriages as the Phantom Express roared past Blackwood Junction without stopping. When he opened his eyes, the cold air was still, the quiet had returned, and the only proof that anything had occurred was the lingering metallic taste of dread on his tongue. The signal box light was gone. Elias Vance was now alone on the platform, and the terrible silence had claimed him. He knew, with sudden, absolute certainty, that he wasn't waiting for a relief engine. He was waiting for whatever came next. Story 2. Arrival at Seaview. The first thing Elias noticed about the island wasn't the smell of salt or the cry of gulls, but the silence, a cotton wool silence enforced by the fog. It was not the thin, coastal mist that rolled in and out with the tide. This was a thick, viscous, perpetual fog, clinging to the rock face of the island like a parasitic shroud. It was less weather, and more an absence of the world. Elias had been running for 6 months, ever since the scandal at the National Weather Service. They'd called it the fjord disaster, but to him, it was just a failed prediction, a catastrophic statistical outlier that cost 23 lives. He was deemed unfit for public service, too erratic, too obsessed with the impossible variables he claimed to see in the data. When the posting came through, automated lighthouse technician, Seaview Island, 1-year contract, total isolation, generous hazard pay, Elias had taken it immediately. He wanted to be forgotten. A place defined by its absence of clear sky seemed fitting for a man who had lost his ability to predict the light. The supply boat, a rust-streaked trawler named the Skipper, dropped him off at the barely visible jetty. The captain, a man whose face seemed sculpted from granite, hadn't made eye contact once. "That's the last run for a month, son," the captain had rasped, his voice muffled by the fog. "Got your oil, your diesel, and enough dehydrated stuff to last a war. Remember the schedule, the maintenance schedule?" Elias asked, hoisting his heavy duffel bag onto the slippery stone steps. The captain squinted at him through the dense white air. "No, the light schedule. You don't mess with the light. You don't look for the sun. You just watch the dark." Before Elias could ask what he meant, the skipper's engine roared, and the vessel dissolved back into the mist, leaving nothing but the sound of water slapping the rocks. The lighthouse, the Seaview Lighthouse, was shorter than Elias had expected, stockier, built like a fortress. Its base was made of large, interlocking blocks of dark basalt, weathered smooth by endless spray. A brass plaque, tarnished green and black, read, "Seaview Lighthouse. 1898. The air was stagnant, heavy with the metallic scent of damp stone and something else, something Elias couldn't place. It was faint, yet pervasive. A deep, musky odor of old rope, whale oil, and cold, wet leather. It was the smell of the 19th century, preserved, The door, thick oak banded with iron, creaked open with a sound that felt less like a hinge moving, and more like a tomb being reluctantly unsealed. Inside, the light station was immaculate but frozen in time. The winding metal stairs leading up to the lamp house were polished, the brass railings gleaming despite the moisture. The main living quarters, a small, circular room carved into the stone base, was sparse. A cot, a simple iron stove, a desk bolted to the floor, and a shelf of battered maritime reference books. Elias unpacked quickly. He placed his few personal items, a compass, a worn copy of Melville, and a framed photo of his sister, on the desk. He felt the weight of his isolation immediately. The thick walls muted the world outside, and the perpetual twilight filtering through the single, thick glass window made the midday feel like dusk. His job was simple. Monitor the automated lamp system, check the diesel generator, and log atmospheric pressure readings. He was to send a brief status report via satellite uplink every 48 hours. He spent the rest of the day checking the machinery. The Fresnel lens at the top of the tower was a marvel, a labyrinth of glass prisms and brass housing. Even unlit, it gathered the ambient gloom and magnified it into weak, shivering spirals on the walls. As night fell, and the fog pressed harder against the glass, the primary lamp ignited with a satisfying thrum. Its massive beam swung out, cutting a sickly yellow swath through the impenetrable white. It was comforting, for a moment, to see the light fight back against the overwhelming absence. The third watch Elias fell into a rhythm defined by the light's rotation. 2 seconds of illumination, 4 seconds of blackout. Thrum click, silence. Thrum click, silence. The first day passed in checks and logs. The second day was characterized by profound, gnawing boredom. Elias tried to read, tried to write, but the silence, interrupted only by the thrum click, was distracting. He felt like an insect trapped inside a grandfather clock. On the morning of the third day, the anomaly began. He was sitting at the desk, drinking a bitter cup of instant coffee, when the cold, wet leather scent returned, much stronger this time. It was accompanied by a sound he initially dismissed as the wind, but the wind was muffled by the fog. This sound was structured, rhythmic, the deep, melancholic groan of old wood under immense strain. It was a sound Elias, a former sailor in his youth, recognized instantly. The sound of a ship's hull working hard against heavy seas, but close enough to hear the individual planks crying out. He jumped up and scrambled toward the single window. He pressed his face against the cold glass, trying to pierce the wall of white, but saw nothing. The fog was absolute. Creak. Groan. The sound was close. Creak. Groan. Followed by a dull, heavy thud, like a thick rope hitting a deck. Elias unbolted the steel security plate on the door and raced up the winding stairs to the lamp house. He emerged into the rotating beacon chamber. The light swept around, uselessly illuminating only the fog directly in front of the lens. He peered into the dense white void. His breath hitched. He couldn't see the ship, but he could hear the voices. They were faint, shouting in a language he couldn't parse, though it sounded Scandinavian or German. Sharp, guttural commands lost to the spray. And then, he heard the single, distinct, terrifying sound of canvas snapping taut. He was high up, looking straight out over the water. The sounds placed the vessel impossibly close, right at the edge of the shallow reef that guarded the island. Any modern vessel, even a trawler, would have a horn, a radio, a visible radar signature, a crew panicking at the proximity of the rocks. But this ship was sailing silently, perfectly, without a single radio wave or engine noise, executing a maneuver that should have ended in disaster. Then, the fog shifted. It didn't lift, it sheared, peeling back just enough to create a momentary, half-mile-long tunnel of visibility leading straight out to sea. And there it was. It was a whaling brig, circa 1880, its three masts bristling with furled, heavy sail. The hull was black and impossibly clean, the lines of its rigging taut and perfect. It was a beautiful, terrible anachronism. It had the high, carved prow and the heavy, black whaleboats hanging ready from their davits. Standing at the helm was a man in a thick, oilskin coat, his back to the lighthouse. Scattered across the deck were other figures, all moving with the practiced, disciplined economy of a working crew. They were all wearing clothes that had been obsolete for a century, and their faces, what Elias could glimpse, were pale, utterly serene, and focused on the sea ahead. They were hauling the foreyard, their ropes slick with water. They were performing a perfect, tight maneuver to put the bow into the wind. But the wind, Elias knew, was zero. The air was dead still. And the ship was sailing on a reef line, aimed directly for a collision. Elias gripped the cold brass railing, his knuckles white. This was not a derelict ship, it was not a trick of the light. This was a fully manned, perfectly preserved, dead ship. He started to scream, but the thick glass of the lamp house only reflected his silent terror. He watched, mesmerized, as the man at the helm gave one final, decisive command, a soundless motion of his hand. The men braced themselves. The brig sailed on, right into the curtain of thick, consuming fog. The sight lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then, the sheer in the fog snapped shut. The white wall returned, absolute and unforgiving. The sound of the groaning hull and the snapping canvas was gone. The smell of oil and old leather vanished. Only the relentless, mechanical thrum-click of the automated light remained. Elias stood there, shivering, long after the moment had passed. He looked at the date on the calendar he'd taped to the wall, Wednesday. He went back down to the desk, pulled out the lighthouse log, and wrote a single entry for the day, 8:14 a.m. Fog thickness. Maximum. Sighted 1 3-masted whaling brig, unregistered, perfect condition. Crew of approximately 15. Disappeared instantly. Phenomenon logged. He sealed the log shut and tried to tell himself it was exhaustion, or the isolation, or a trick of the swirling fog. But as he stared out the window, he realized the terrifying impossibility of the scene. The ship had sailed right past the deepest, most treacherous part of the reef. And it had been perfectly positioned to be sighted from the lighthouse on a clear day. He walked over to the shelf and picked up a copy of the Seaview Keeper's Almanac, 1912. Inside, a loose, brittle newspaper clipping, dated October 3, 1901, fell out. The headline, yellowed and faded, read, "The whaling brig, the Aurora, lost on Seaview Reef. No survivors." Elias had arrived on Seaview Island on October 1st. Today was October 3rd. He looked at the calendar on the wall. Today was Wednesday, October 3rd. The cold grip of the perpetual fog tightened around him. He felt the terrible certainty that he hadn't just seen a ghost. He had witnessed a moment of time, perfectly preserved, cycling again. And he had a chilling feeling that if he stayed, he would see it again in the future. He just needed to figure out how long the cycle lasted. Story 3. The inherited geometry. Elias Vance was a man who understood angles. For 10 years, he had defined space, calculated loads, and respected the fundamental constraints of three-dimensional geometry. Buildings followed rules. A wall was a wall, a ceiling was a ceiling, and the sum of the interior volume could never exceed the exterior shell. Stonehaven Manor was where geometry went to die. He arrived late in the afternoon, the sky the color of old pewter. The manor sat on a desolate rise overlooking a valley of twisted, skeletal trees, miles from the nearest paved road. It was his inheritance from a great uncle he'd never met, a final, absurd gift after Elias had lost his firm, his reputation, and his life savings in a spectacular construction failure back in the city. He'd come to Stonehaven to hide, to liquidate the property, and to disappear. From the outside, the house looked imposing but finite. It was a sturdy, 3-story Tudor structure, built from local gray fieldstone, its windows narrow and dark like judgmental eyes. Elias estimated its footprint at maybe 3,000 square feet. Manageable, saleable. He stepped out of his battered rental car and felt the immediate, profound silence of the moor. The air tasted of damp earth and moss, and there was no sound of distant traffic, no electric hum, only the soft, persistent whisper of the wind trying to pry loose the ivy that coated the chimney stacks. He found the key exactly where the solicitor's letter had promised. Rusted, heavy, and tucked beneath a broken bird bath. The impossible foyer, the iron-banded oak front door opened with the grating sound of stone rubbing against stone. The smell that hit Elias was not the expected damp mold or rot, but something far more unsettling. The cold, clean scent of dry, unused air, mixed with old wax and the faint, metallic tang of ozone. Elias stepped inside, flicked the weak beam of his torch, and immediately stopped breathing. The foyer was a dizzying, cathedral-like vault. It was impossibly wide and impossibly tall. The ceiling, lost in the gloom 50 feet above, should have been poking through the roofline he had just observed from the yard. The room was at least 40 feet across, a measurement that would have pushed the outer walls far past the boundaries of the structure he had estimated. Elias, the architect, stood in the heart of a paradox. Impossible, he whispered, backing up until his spine hit the door. He swung the door shut, listening to the iron bolt drop back into place. Click. He was locked in. He moved cautiously, letting the torchlight play over the space. The walls were clad in dark, hand-carved oak paneling, featuring obscure, disturbing floral patterns and stylized faces that seemed to frown down at him. A massive, curving staircase, wide enough for 2 carriages, dominated the far end of the room, climbing into the upper darkness. He pulled out the only document he had, a rudimentary floor plan supplied by the solicitor. It was a single sheet, labeled, ground floor, showing a predictable layout. Library, dining room, kitchen, and a foyer roughly 15 by 15 feet. He was standing in a room at least 4 times that size. He crossed the stone floor toward the stairs, his footsteps echoing in a way that suggested not just vast space, but sheer volume. Halfway across, he found a door that was not on the blueprint. It was a small, unassuming door, set flush into the dark paneling beneath the main stairwell. It had no knob or latch, only a single, heavy bronze plate shaped like a serpent swallowing its own tail, the Ouroboros. In the serpent's loop was a keyhole, intricately detailed. Elias tried to jiggle the key he had, but it was too large. He pressed his ear against the wood. Silence. Not the quiet of an empty closet, but the deep, deafening quiet of a vacuum. He ran his hand along the doorframe. The wood was cold, colder than the surrounding stone, and felt subtly different, as if the grain were vibrating at a frequency too low to hear. He took out a small electronic level from his bag and pressed it against the surface. The display, which should have read 0.0 feet, flickered wildly, cycling through negative and positive numbers before settling on a flashing air. Elias stepped back. He was certain that whatever was happening in Stonehaven, it was centered in that locked space. The shifting hull ignoring the serpentine door for the moment, Elias followed the plan, searching for the library, which was marked as the first room off the main hall. He pushed open a standard-sized, recessed oak door and found himself in a hallway. The hallway was straight, long, and lined with tall, empty portrait niches. It should have been approximately 20 feet long, leading directly to the library, according to the map. Elias started walking. He walked 20 feet. He was still in the hallway. He walked 50 feet. Still the hallway. He walked 100 feet. The hallway stretched ahead, seemingly infinite, receding into the gloom. He stopped, his heart beginning to hammer. The air was getting denser, and the ozone smell was stronger, almost acrid. He turned to look back at the door he had just entered through. It was gone. Instead of the solid, recessed door, the hallway now terminated in a seamless stretch of dark wood paneling. There was no seam, no knob, no indentation, just solid, uninterrupted oak. He tried pushing against the wall where the door should be, but it was as unyielding as concrete. He was trapped in a hallway that was longer than the entire house. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. This was not disorientation. This was a purposeful, physical alteration of space. The architecture was actively hostile. He forced himself to breathe, recalling his training. The building must have a core. He kept moving forward, running his hand along the paneling, searching for a seam, a light switch, anything to anchor himself to reality. The niches along the wall were now appearing closer together, then suddenly farther apart. The angle of the floor seemed to subtly shift beneath his feet, forcing him to lean slightly to the right to maintain balance, even though the hallway appeared perfectly straight. Then, the hallway ended. It didn't end with a door or a corner, but with a sudden, sharp, impossible turn. It was like walking into a corner on a two-dimensional plane. Elias slammed into the wall, bruising his shoulder. He raised his torch. The corner was not a 90-degree angle. It was a dizzying, convex curve, forming a tight, smooth parabola. The hallway now continued to his left, but it was narrower, the ceiling had dropped to 7 feet, and the beautiful oak paneling was replaced by cheap, brittle gypsum board painted a faded, sickly yellow. Elias looked back the way he had come. The vast, oak-paneled corridor he had been traversing was now just a small, rectangular opening in the gypsum wall. It was a doorframe leading into a room of impossible size, a room he had just been trapped in, yet which now looked like a mere closet. He pressed his fingers to his temples. The house was not merely confusing. It was folding space. He took a tentative step into the yellow hallway. He heard a sound that chilled him to his soul. The soft, heavy thud of the unseen walls, shifting into a new configuration behind him. He was in the library now. Not the grand room on the plan, but a tiny, cramped space lined with shelves of moldering books. The scent of ozone had intensified. And on the desk, illuminated by his torch beam, was a single, leather-bound volume, open to a page filled with dense, unsettling handwriting. Elias knew, with cold certainty, that the manor was playing a game, and he was the pawn in its infinite geometry. He was here because the house had invited him. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.